Delphine Hargrove had been living alone in a line shack at the edge of the Bitterroot Range for the better part of 3 years when Ezra Colt found her, half frozen and following a wounded elk's blood trail that had led him considerably further off his own course than he had intended. And the first thing she did, before offering him water or asking his business, was set a skinning knife on the table between them, where he could see it plainly, the blade catching what little firelight the small shack offered. "I warned you I bite," she said, though he had not yet reached for anything at all, had not so much as stepped fully through her doorway, standing instead just past the threshold, with rain still dripping off his hat brim, and the warning arrived with the flat, practiced cadence of a sentence she had delivered so many times it no longer required any particular feeling behind it. "Whatever brought you up this mountain, mister, you would do well to state it plainly, and be on your way before dark, storm or no storm." Ezra Colt, a trapper and sometime guide of perhaps 40, with a beard gone mostly grey, and a manner so unhurried it seemed to belong to the mountains themselves rather than to any particular man, looked at the knife, looked at the woman who had placed it there with such deliberate calm, and said, "Duly noted, ma'am. I lost my way chasing a wounded elk and find myself needing shelter before the storm coming over that ridge arrives in full force. I do not intend to trouble you beyond that, and I will sit exactly as far from that knife as makes you comfortable, for as long as the weather requires it." He did not reach for her hand that first evening. He would not reach for it, in fact, for the better part of a year, understanding without being told that Delphine Hargrove's warning was not a threat to be tested carelessly, but a boundary earned through some history he did not yet know the shape of, and that a man wanting to cross it honestly would need to earn the crossing slowly, rather than simply attempt it on the strength of a single stormy night's shelter. What Ezra Colt did not yet understand, settling onto the small bench she grudgingly indicated with a nod rather than an invitation, his wet coat steaming faintly in the warmth of her small fire, was exactly how many years of accumulated warnings had built the wall Delphine kept between herself and every living soul who wandered near her mountain, or how patient a man would eventually need to become to see any of it come down, one careful, unhurried visit at a time. To understand why Delphine Hargrove greeted strangers with a knife on the table, you have to understand what happened to her in Virginia City 3 years earlier, before she fled to a mountain isolated enough that few men troubled to climb it. She had been married, briefly and disastrously, to a man named Otto Vance, a mine foreman whose courtship had been all soft words and careful attention until the ring was on her finger, at which point the softness curdled into something considerably harder within the first month. Otto had not simply raised his voice. He had raised his hands more than once, and Delphine had spent 2 years learning exactly which of his moods preceded which kind of violence, the particular quiet before a bad evening, the specific way his jaw set when the whiskey had gone past a certain point, until a night when his fury outran even her practiced vigilance and left her with a broken wrist and the settled understanding that she would either leave that valley or eventually die in it. She had left in the night, with nothing but a horse she did not entirely own and a knife she had taken from Otto's own kitchen, and had climbed higher into the Bitterroot Range than any reasonable person expected a woman alone to survive, precisely because unreasonable difficulty was the one thing Otto Vance would never trouble himself to pursue, being a man who preferred his comforts too well to chase a runaway wife up a mountain that could kill even an experienced trapper in the wrong season. In the 3 years since, Delphine had encountered perhaps a dozen men passing through her isolated stretch of mountain, trappers and prospectors, and the occasional lost hunter, and she had met every single one of them with the same knife on the table and the same flat warning, because she had learned, at considerable physical cost, that a woman's safety depended entirely on convincing dangerous men she was not worth the trouble before they had the chance to discover otherwise. Most of the dozen had left within the hour, unsettled by her manner, which suited Delphine perfectly, since driving them off was the entire point of the performance, and the 1 or 2 who had lingered longer had eventually grown bored of a difficult woman who offered them nothing but sharp words and a locked door, and had moved on of their own accord, without Delphine needing to do more than simply remain exactly as unwelcoming as she had started. Ezra Colt's own patience with her warning came from a considerably different history, though one that had taught him, in its own way, exactly how much a frightened creature needed time rather than pressure. He had spent the better part of 2 decades trapping and guiding through some of the most unforgiving country in the territory, and had learned, working alongside wounded and wary animals more often than wounded and wary people, that nothing useful ever came from rushing a creature that had been hurt badly enough to need its teeth. He had lost a young trapping partner years earlier, a boy of 19 named Micah, who had pushed too hard and too fast on a wounded wolf that any patient man would have simply left alone to heal or die on its own terms. And the boy's death, quick and entirely preventable, had taught Ezra, permanently, the specific difference between courage and recklessness when approaching something that had already been hurt badly enough to view every reaching hand as a threat. Here is the compatibility neither of them could see that first stormy evening. Delphine Hargrove had spent 3 years testing every man's patience with a warning designed to fail that patience quickly, and had concluded, dozen by dozen, that no man's patience would ever hold long enough to matter. Ezra Colt had spent 2 decades learning that the patience itself, applied without any expectation of quick reward, was the only approach that ever actually worked with something wounded badly enough to bite first and ask questions never. Neither of them yet understood that Delphine's mountain was about to become the place where both hard-won lessons finally met and, improbably, matched. The storm that had driven Ezra to her door held through the night and well into the following day. A hard, driving mountain rain that turned every trail on that stretch of the Bitterroot Range into standing water and loose scree, making travel of any kind genuinely dangerous rather than merely unpleasant. And Delphine found herself, considerably against her own preference, sharing her small shelter with a stranger for considerably longer than the single uncomfortable evening she had originally allotted him. She delivered her second warning that first morning, when Ezra offered, mildly, to help mend a section of her roof that had begun leaking during the night, the water dripping steadily into a tin pail she had already set beneath it out of long practice. "I do not need help, mister, and I would remind you I still have that knife within reach. Men who offer help, in my experience, are men calculating what the help ought to purchase them in return, and I have learned that lesson at considerably higher cost than a leaking roof," Ezra said, without any particular offense in his tone, climbing to his feet regardless. "Duly noted again, ma'am. I will mend the roof, because a man raised right does not sit idle watching a woman's shelter leak when his own 2 hands could fix it in an hour's work. And I do not require anything in return beyond staying dry myself, since I am sheltering under that same roof for the duration of this storm, and would rather not drip on my own bedroll either." He mended the roof that morning, with materials he found stacked, unused in her small woodshed, working with the unhurried competence of a man who had built and repaired a great many shelters in a great many unforgiving places, and asked nothing further of her beyond a place to sit while it dried. Delphine watched him work from a careful distance, the knife still resting on the table within easy reach, and found herself entirely unable to identify the calculation she had been so certain must be underneath his offer, turning the puzzle of him over and over, without arriving at any conclusion that matched the dozen men who had come before him. The storm kept Ezra Colt at her shelter for 3 full days, and across those 3 days, Delphine delivered 4 more variations of her warning, each one tested against some new small kindness he offered without being asked. Splitting firewood into a neat, seasoned stack beside her door, checking her horse's shoe, and finding a loose nail he replaced without comment, identifying a healing herb growing near her water source that she had walked past 1,000 times in 3 years without ever recognizing its use. Each warning, Ezra absorbed with the same even, unhurried, duly noted, and continued exactly what he had been doing, neither retreating from her sharpness, nor pushing further than she indicated she could tolerate, a rhythm that began, by the second day, to feel almost like its own strange kind of conversation between them. On the third evening, with the storm finally beginning to break and the last grey light fading behind the western ridge, Delphine found herself saying, almost despite herself, "You do not seem troubled by any of this, mister." Most men would have left the moment the rain thinned enough to make the trail passable again. Ezra said, "I have spent 20 years around creatures a great deal more dangerous than an armed woman, with good reason for her caution, ma'am. Wolves, bears, a mountain lion or two that did not care for my company. I find that most warnings, delivered honestly, deserve to be believed rather than argued with, and I believe yours entirely. I simply do not find it changes my intention to be decent company while the weather keeps me here, since decency costs a man nothing and occasionally earns him considerably more than he expected." Ezra Colt left when the storm cleared, as he had always intended to, and Delphine expected, watching him ride down the mountain trail until he disappeared into the tree line, that she had seen the last of him, the same conclusion she had reached about every other man who passed through her isolated stretch of wilderness. She was wrong. Ezra returned 3 weeks later, ostensibly to check a trap line that ran near her shelter, and brought with him a small sack of coffee and sugar, supplies he set on her table without ceremony and without any accompanying demand, before turning immediately to the actual business of walking his trap line, as though the visit required no further explanation at all. Delphine met this return with her 5th warning, sharper than the previous 4, unsettled by a persistence she had not accounted for in 3 years of successfully driving every other man away. "I do not need charity, and I do not need a man deciding my mountain is somewhere he is welcome simply because a storm once stranded him here. I have managed alone for 3 years, mister, and I intend to keep managing alone for however many more the good Lord allots me," Ezra said, setting the last of the coffee sack down and turning to leave for his trap line. "It is not charity, ma'am, it is coffee, freely given between 2 people who occupy the same stretch of mountain and might as well be neighborly about it. I do not require your welcome. I simply intend to keep checking my trap line, which happens to run near your shelter, and I will keep bringing coffee when I have extra, and you are welcome to keep refusing my company each time, exactly as long as you require, since refusing costs you nothing, and I am not troubled by the refusing." This pattern repeated itself across the following months, Ezra returning every few weeks with some small, practical offering, a length of good rope, a jar of preserves from a trade with a neighboring homestead, once a proper iron skillet, to replace the dented one she had been making do with, and Delphine meeting each visit with a fresh variation of her warning, sharper some months when old memories of Otto surfaced without warning, wearier others, when the accumulated weight of vigilance simply exhausted her capacity for sharpness, and Ezra absorbing every one of them with the same unhurried acceptance, never pushing past whatever distance she indicated on a given day, never once treating her sharpness as an invitation to argue her out of it or to demand she explain herself further than she chose to. By the 4th month, Delphine had stopped setting the knife directly on the table when she saw him approaching along the trail, though she kept it within reach in her apron pocket, out of a caution too deeply ingrained to abandon entirely, a small, unconscious softening that she herself did not fully register until the evening Ezra pointed out, gently, that she had not delivered a warning at all during his entire visit that day. A full 3 hours of ordinary conversation about weather and traps, and the coming winter that had passed without a single sharp word between them. Delphine considered this observation for a long moment, genuinely startled by its accuracy, turning over the whole afternoon in her memory, and finding, to her own surprise, that he was entirely correct, and said only that she supposed she had simply forgotten, though both of them understood the forgetting meant considerably more than the words themselves suggested. The full account of Otto Vance came out on a winter evening nearly 8 months after Ezra's first storm-bound visit, prompted by nothing more dramatic than Ezra mentioning, in passing, that he had once known a mine foreman in Virginia City by that same name, a man other trappers spoke of poorly, a small, unremarkable comment offered while he mended a harness by her fire. Delphine went very still at the name, her hands freezing over the stew she had been stirring on the small iron stove, and Ezra, watching the stillness immediately, set the harness aside and said carefully, "I have said something that troubles you." She told him then, in halting pieces at first, and then in a rush once the beginning was spoken, about the courtship and the marriage, and the 2 years of learning to read a violent man's moods, about the broken wrist, and the night she finally understood that leaving was the only alternative to dying in that valley, about the knife taken from his own kitchen in the dark, and the horse she did not entirely own, and the climb up a mountain she had chosen specifically because it was too difficult for a comfortable man like Otto to ever bother pursuing a runaway wife across. Ezra listened to the entire account without interrupting, his own hands very still in his lap where he had set the harness, and when she finished, the fire popping quietly between them, he said, "I am sorry that man ever touched you, Delphine, and I am sorry it took a mountain this unforgiving to finally keep you safe from him. I understand your knife now considerably better than I did that first stormy evening. I understood it was earned. I did not fully understand, until just now, exactly what it had been earned by, or how much it had cost you to earn it," Delphine said, wiping her eyes with the back of one hand, angry at herself for the tears even as she let them fall. "I have warned every man who has come near this mountain in 3 years, Ezra, and every single one of them eventually left, either because my warning worked exactly as intended or because they simply lost interest in a difficult woman on a difficult mountain. You are the only one who has never once left for good. I do not entirely know what to do with that, and it frightens me more than Otto's fists ever did, in its own way." Ezra said, "You do not need to do anything with it tonight. I will keep bringing coffee and checking my trap line and absorbing whatever warning you find yourself needing to deliver on a given day, for as long as it takes you to trust that the pattern is not going to change. I am not in any hurry, Delphine. I have not been in a hurry since the day I met you, and I do not intend to start being in a hurry now, of all times." Spring came to the Bitterroot Range nearly a full year after Ezra Colt had first stumbled onto Delphine's shelter, chasing a wounded elk through a gathering storm, and it was on an ordinary afternoon, with no particular occasion to mark it, the last of the season's snow finally melting off the higher ridges in long silver streams, that Ezra finally did the one thing he had deliberately avoided across a full year of patient, careful visits. They were sitting together on the small bench outside her shelter, watching that thaw work its way down the mountainside, and Ezra, in the middle of an unremarkable observation about the coming season and whether the trap lines would need moving before the ground softened further, reached over and took Delphine's hand in his own, a simple, unhurried gesture offered with no more ceremony than he had brought to mending her roof a year earlier, as though it were simply the next ordinary thing a man did while sitting beside a woman he had come to know well. Delphine's whole body went rigid, the old, practiced reflex rising before she could stop it, her free hand twitching toward the apron pocket, where the knife no longer always rested, but where her instincts still reached regardless. And she said, sharp and immediate, the words leaving her before any conscious thought could shape them, "I warned you I bite!" Ezra did not release her hand. He looked at her, steady and unhurried as he had been every single day of the past year, his grip gentle but entirely unafraid, and said, "Duly noted," and reached anyway, closing his fingers gently around hers, waiting to see what she would actually do, rather than what her old warning insisted she must. His own pulse, had she thought to check it, considerably calmer than her own. Delphine sat frozen for a long moment, every instinct built across 3 years of necessary vigilance, screaming at her to pull away, to reach for the knife still riding in her apron pocket some days out of old habit, to do whatever was required to end this reaching, before it could cost her anything at all, the way every previous reaching hand in her life eventually had. And then, slowly, watching Ezra's calm, patient face and feeling nothing in his grip but warmth, she understood that nothing in her actually wanted to pull away, that the year of coffee and mended roofs and absorbed warnings had built something in her chest that her old reflexes had not yet caught up to, and she let her hand remain in his, trembling slightly, but remaining, the trembling itself gradually easing the longer he simply held on without demanding anything further of her. She said, quietly, once the trembling had mostly stilled, "I did warn you, more than once, if I recall correctly." Ezra said, "You did, several times in fact, and I believed you entirely, every single time. I simply decided, some months back, watching you set that knife aside more days than not, that a warning meant to protect a wounded woman from further harm was not the same thing as a warning meant to keep out a man who had no intention of causing any, and I judged the difference worth the risk of finding out which one yours actually was." The months that followed that first held hand were not a sudden transformation so much as a continued, gentle unwinding of 3 years of necessary armor, Delphine finding, week by week, that the sharp warnings she had delivered so automatically for so long simply had less and less occasion to surface at all, her hands finding fewer and fewer reasons to reach for anything sharper than a mending needle when Ezra came walking up the trail. She told Ezra, one evening, that she had begun to notice the absence of the knife from her apron pocket some days entirely, having simply forgotten to place it there each morning, the way she once had without fail for 3 straight years. And Ezra told her that he considered the forgetting itself the finest compliment he had ever been paid by anyone, man or woman, in the whole of his 40 years, considerably more meaningful than any words could have offered him. Ezra moved his own small cabin's operations closer to her shelter that summer, not asking to share her roof outright, understanding that such a request would have undone months of careful, patient trust in a single overreaching moment, but building his own modest structure close enough that neither of them needed to travel far to reach the other, a physical distance that shrank, over the following year, in careful proportion to the distance Delphine allowed to shrink between them emotionally, the two of them meeting somewhere in the middle of the mountain each evening, without either one having to abandon the safety of their own separate walls entirely at once. Delphine found herself, for the first time in 3 years, sleeping without the specific, exhausting vigilance she had maintained since fleeing Otto Vance, waking each morning without the particular ache behind her eyes that came from a body that never fully allowed itself to rest. A change so gradual she did not fully notice it until a night she realized she had left her door unbarred entirely, trusting, without quite deciding to trust, that the only person likely to approach it in the night was a man who had spent a full year proving exactly what his reaching hand actually meant. Ezra Colt and Delphine Hargrove were married the following spring, 2 full years after the storm that had first stranded him at her door, in a small ceremony attended by exactly the handful of trappers and guides who knew them both, conducted by a circuit preacher who rode 2 full days through difficult country to reach that isolated stretch of the Bitterroot Range. The ceremony held outside her small shelter, with the same mountains that had once been her only reliable protection, now standing witness to a trust she had never expected to build with any living man. Delphine never fully lost the sharpness that Otto Vance's violence had first forged into her, and Ezra never once asked her to, understanding, better than most men ever would, that the sharpness itself was not a flaw to be sanded away, but a hard-won skill that had kept her alive through 3 years no gentler woman might have survived. She remained for the whole of her life, a woman who spoke her mind plainly and expected honesty in return. And Ezra came to consider that same sharpness one of the qualities he valued most in her, precisely because he understood exactly what it had cost her to build, and exactly what it meant that she had chosen, eventually, to let it soften around him specifically, and only him. They raised, over the following years, an unusually large number of orphaned or injured wild animals that wandered onto their shared land, wolves and elk calves, and once, memorably, a bear cub separated from its mother during a spring flood that Ezra found shivering and alone on a gravel bar. And neighbors who visited often remarked that Delphine seemed to possess a particular gift for gentling creatures that arrived wounded and distrustful, coaxing even the most frightened animals into eating from her open hand within weeks, a gift Ezra always said, with a private smile, she had first practiced, with considerable and hard-won success, on him. The poet Emily Dickinson, writing in roughly that same era about the particular architecture of a wounded heart, once observed that the soul selects her own society, then shuts the door, and Ezra Colt came to believe, in his own later years, that Delphine had done exactly that on the day she fled Virginia City, shutting a door that had every reason to remain shut permanently against a world that had already shown her precisely what it was capable of. What Ezra never fully took credit for, though Delphine insisted on giving it to him regardless every time the story was retold, was the year of patient, unhurried knocking that had finally convinced her the door was safe to open again, if only partway at first, for exactly one careful, unhurried man who had never once mistaken her warnings for an invitation to push harder. The naturalist John Muir, who spent his own life among mountains not unlike the ones that sheltered Delphine, once wrote that going out, he found, was really going in, and Ezra Colt came to believe, turning the phrase over in his later years, that his own long walks up to Delphine's shelter across that patient first year had been exactly that kind of journey, a going out into difficult country that turned out, step by careful step, to be the only road that ever led him properly inward, toward the one person willing, eventually, to let him all the way in. Delphine and Ezra lived on that mountain together for 31 years, and she kept, until her own death, the same knife she had once carried out of Otto Vance's kitchen in the dark of that final terrible night. Not out of any remaining fear, but as a plain, physical reminder of the woman she had needed to become in order to survive long enough to meet the man who never once needed her to stop being exactly that woman, warnings and all, sharp edges included. A warning meant to protect can look, from the outside, exactly like a warning meant to wound. The difference only becomes visible to the one person patient enough to test it, again and again, until the answer finally holds steady. Tell me in the comments. Do you think it takes a full year of patient, unhurried proof to earn someone's trust after a wound like Delphine's, or can it happen faster than that? And if you want another story about a guarded heart that finally believed the proof standing right in front of it, the next one is waiting for you right now.